The invitation had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Heavy cardstock. Gold embossing. Ruth had watched her husband slide it from the envelope, scan the calligraphy, and set it down without a word. When she finally asked about it that evening, he was already halfway up the stairs. "It is nothing you would enjoy," he said without turning around. Foundation dinner. Board members. Tedious. She did not press. She had learned, over 7 years, which silences were worth breaking. On the third morning, after Bernard left for the office and their son Oliver was settled with his puzzle books, Ruth finally picked up the invitation. The paper was thick and cool against her fingers. The Corbin Foundation Annual Benefit Gala, it read. Honoring excellence in pharmaceutical innovation. Beneath the date was a smaller line, printed in elegant script. Mr. Bernard Watts and guest. And guest. Not her name. Not Mrs. Watts. Just a placeholder. A blank space where a person should be. Ruth set the card down carefully, as though it might leave a mark on her skin if she held it too long. That afternoon, her phone buzzed with a notification. A colleague from Bernard's company had posted photographs from a conference in San Francisco. Ruth had not known he was attending. She scrolled without thinking, the way a person touches a bruise to see if it still hurts. And then she stopped. Bernard stood at the center of the frame, champagne in hand, laughing. His face was open and warm in a way she had not seen directed at her in months. And beside him, leaning into the shot as though she belonged there, was a woman Ruth recognized. Sylvia Porter, Director of Communications. Blonde. Polished. Wearing the kind of dress Ruth had not owned in years. There were other photographs. Sylvia at the podium. Sylvia and Bernard at dinner. Sylvia and Bernard on a rooftop, the city glittering behind them like scattered diamonds. The last image stopped her breath. Bernard's hand rested on Sylvia's shoulder. He was looking at her the way he used to look at Ruth. The way he had looked at her when looking at her still meant something. Ruth closed the application. Put the phone face down on the table. Sat very still while the world tilted slightly beneath her. That evening, she tried. "I saw the photographs from San Francisco," she said. Bernard did not look up from his tablet. "What photographs?" "The conference." Sylvia was there. Of course she was. He scrolled through something, his attention elsewhere. "She handles media relations." Ruth's voice was steady, but her hands were not. "You did not tell me you were going. It was last minute. I did not think you would care. I am your wife." Now he looked at her. Not with anger. That would have been easier. He looked at her with patience. The kind of patience a person reserves for explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand. "Ruth, these events require a certain presence. Sylvia understands the industry. She knows how to work a room. It is not personal. It is practical." The words settled over her like a cold fog. "I could come," she said. "To the gala. I could come with you." Bernard exhaled slowly. "I do not think that is a good idea." "Why not?" He set the tablet down. Folded his hands. Spoke to her the way one speaks to a child who has asked an impossible question. "You are not comfortable in those settings. You have said so yourself. And honestly, Ruth." He paused, choosing his words with the precision of a man who believes precision makes cruelty acceptable. "You are not what people expect to see beside me." The sentence landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spreading outward, touching everything. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Bernard stood, touched her shoulder briefly, and walked upstairs. The gesture was almost kind, which made it worse. He believed he had explained something. He believed the conversation was finished. Ruth sat in the kitchen for a long time. The invitation was still on the counter. The words blurred and steadied, as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Welcome back to another powerful story, my beloved listeners. Kindly tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are at. If you are new here, prepare for a story of betrayal, unexpected love, and what truly makes a family. Drop everything and listen closely. This tale of heartbreak and redemption might just change how you view love and family forever. Have you ever been erased by the person who promised to see you? Have you ever watched someone parade another woman in public while you raise their child in private? Have you ever been told you are not what people expect, as if your existence required an apology? If you have ever been made to feel like a liability in your own life, this story is for you. Stay with me, because what Ruth does next will remind you of something important. You were never invisible. You were just standing in a room with people who refused to look. Ruth Hollis had not always been invisible. Before Bernard, she had been an artist. A botanical illustrator whose work appeared in journals, textbooks, museum exhibitions across the country. Her renderings of native flora were known for their precision and their warmth. Scientific accuracy rendered with an almost tender attention. Critics had called her work meticulous and quietly stunning. She worked in a studio with northern light that fell across her specimens like a blessing. She kept plants in jars along the windowsill, pressed flowers between the pages of old books, brushes lined up in order of thickness like soldiers awaiting instruction. Her hands knew the weight of ink, the grain of paper, the particular green of new leaves in early spring. She was not famous in the way that makes strangers recognize your face. But she was known. She was respected. She was seen. She met Bernard at a gallery opening in Philadelphia, the autumn she turned 34. Her sketches of Pennsylvania wildflowers were featured in a small side room. Most guests passed through quickly on their way to the main exhibition. But one man wandered in by accident and stayed for an hour. He stood before a watercolor of trout lilies for so long that Ruth began to wonder if something was wrong with it. "You did these," he said finally. It was not a question. She nodded. "They are extraordinary." She thanked him. He told her his name. Bernard Watts. The name meant nothing to her then. She did not follow pharmaceutical fortunes or read business magazines. She knew plants, not portfolios. He bought 2 pieces that evening. Asked her to dinner. She said no, because she did not know him and because she was working on a commission that needed her full attention. He asked again the following week. She said no again. The third time, he sent a note with a single trout lily pressed between sheets of wax paper. "I am not usually this persistent," he wrote. "But I am not usually this certain either." She said yes. The courtship was everything she had not expected. Bernard was heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, educated at institutions whose names appeared on buildings. He wore his wealth lightly, spoke carefully, and seemed genuinely interested in her work. He asked questions about pigment and paper, about how she achieved the particular green of new growth. He remembered the details she shared. He listened. She fell in love slowly at first, then all at once, the way a person falls asleep and then suddenly finds themselves dreaming. They married in a small ceremony at his family's estate, 14 months after their first dinner. Her parents attended, quiet and proud in clothes they had bought for the occasion. His parents attended, cordial and distant, making conversation as though they were interviewing a candidate for a position they were not sure needed filling. She wore a simple dress. He wore a dark suit. It was, by all accounts, a beautiful wedding. The first year was gentle. Ruth continued her work in a sunlit studio on the 3rd floor of their home in Philadelphia. A house so large she still sometimes got lost in its hallways. Bernard supported her exhibitions, attended her openings, introduced her to colleagues as my wife, the artist. He said it with pride, or what she believed was pride. She had no reason to doubt him. Then she became pregnant, and the world began to shift. At first, the changes were small, sensible. "You should rest," Bernard said when she told him she was working late on a commission. "The baby needs you healthy." She agreed. It made sense. He suggested she postpone a gallery showing scheduled for her 7th month. "Just until after the birth," he said. "There will be other opportunities." She agreed to that too. There would be other opportunities. Oliver was born in the spring, red-faced and furious and perfect. Ruth held him against her chest and felt something unlock inside her that she had not known was closed. She poured herself into motherhood with the same intensity she had once given to her art. She told herself she would return to work when Oliver was older. When things settled. When there was time. But time moved strangely in the house on Delancey Street. Days folded into weeks. Weeks became months. The studio gathered dust. Her brushes waited in their jars like faithful dogs whose owner had forgotten to come home. She did not notice, at first, How small her world had become. The erasure happened in inches, so slowly that she could not identify the moment it began. Bernard stopped asking about her work. At first, she thought he was simply busy. His company was expanding. There were acquisitions, board meetings, responsibilities that kept him at the office until late. She understood. She did not want to be a burden. Then he stopped mentioning the studio altogether. When old colleagues reached out about commissions, he would bring her the messages and suggest gently that perhaps now was not the best time. "You have enough on your plate," he would say. "There is no rush." She stopped being invited to dinners, board functions, industry events. At first, Bernard explained it gently. These were work obligations, tedious and dull. She would not enjoy them. Later, he stopped explaining at all. He would simply mention in passing that he had an event that evening, and she would understand without being told that she was not included. She saw the photographs on social media. Bernard at galas, standing beneath crystal chandeliers. Bernard at conferences, shaking hands with men whose names appeared in newspapers. Bernard accepting awards, his smile broad and confident. And increasingly, beside him, Sylvia Porter. Sylvia whose hair was always perfect. Sylvia whose dresses fit as though they had been sewn directly onto her body. Sylvia who laughed at the right moments, touched his arm when making a point, leaned toward him as though drawn by gravity. Ruth told herself it was nothing. Sylvia was a colleague. A professional asset. Bernard was loyal. Bernard was good. She had no evidence of anything otherwise. But the bed grew colder. The conversations grew shorter. And the woman Ruth had been, the artist, the professional, the person with a name outside these walls, began to fade like ink left too long in the sun. She gained weight after Oliver's birth. Not much, perhaps 15 pounds. But enough that she noticed when her old clothes no longer fit. Enough that she saw it in the mirror, in the softness of her face, the roundness of her arms. Enough that Bernard noticed too. He never said it directly. He did not need to. She felt it in the way he looked at her, or more accurately, in the way he stopped looking at her altogether. His eyes would pass over her as though she were furniture. Something present but not worth attention. One evening, she put on a silk blouse she had not worn in years. One he had once said made her look radiant. She styled her hair. Applied makeup for the first time in months. Went downstairs to greet him when he came home from work. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. "Going somewhere?" he asked. "No. I just thought. You look tired, Ruth. You should rest." He walked past her to his study. The door closed softly behind him. Ruth stood alone in the hallway. Her reflection stared back at her from the foyer mirror, a woman she barely recognized wearing a blouse that no longer fit quite right. That night, she did not cry. She was too tired even for that. The invitation to the Colburn Gala continued to sit on the kitchen counter like an accusation. Ruth did not move it. She did not throw it away. She looked at it sometimes when she was alone, reading those two words over and over until they lost all meaning. And guessed. She imagined what would happen if she simply showed up. Put on one of her old dresses, the ones from before Oliver, and walked into the ballroom on Bernard's arm whether he wanted her there or not. She imagined the look on his face. The surprise. The embarrassment. The embarrassment. That was the word that stopped her. She knew, without him saying it, that her presence would embarrass him. That she had become something to be hidden rather than shown. A secret rather than a partner. A week after the San Francisco photographs, she tried one more time. Bernard was in his office, reviewing documents. She knocked, waited for his acknowledgement, entered. He barely looked up. "I have been thinking about the gala," she said. His pen paused. "About what?" "About coming. With you, Ruth." His voice carried the weight of exhaustion, though she had done nothing to tire him. "We discussed this." "No. You dismissed me. That is different." He set down the pen. Looked at her fully for the first time in what felt like weeks. His expression was not angry. It was something worse. It was patient. "What would you like me to say?" he asked. "The truth is that these events matter for the company. For our future. For Oliver's future. They require a certain image. A certain presentation. And I do not fit that image. He said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Ruth felt something cracking inside her chest, but she held herself still. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Then what am I? She asked. What am I to you? Bernard sighed. You are my wife. You are the mother of my son. That should be enough. It is not, she said quietly. Then perhaps you need to adjust your expectations. The words hung in the air between them. Ruth waited for him to take them back, to soften them, to offer some version of the man who had once sent her pressed flowers and handwritten notes. He returned to his documents. She left the room without another word. That evening, after Oliver was asleep, Ruth stood in front of the bathroom mirror. She looked at herself. Really looked. Her face was still beautiful. Her eyes still bright, even if they were tired. Her body had changed, yes, but it was still hers. It had carried life. It had created a child. That was supposed to mean something. She touched her reflection. Who are you? She whispered. The mirror did not answer. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice said find out. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday. Ruth was scrolling through her phone while Oliver napped. She was not looking for anything specific. Just passing time. Filling the silence with the noise of other people's lives. Then she saw it. A business magazine had published a profile of Bernard. She clicked without thinking, curious to see what they had written about her husband. The article celebrated his leadership, his vision, his transformation of what's pharmaceutical from a family company into a national powerhouse. There were photographs throughout. Bernard in the boardroom. Bernard at a charity event. Bernard accepting an industry award. In every photograph where a woman appeared, it was Sylvia. One caption read, "What's with longtime partner Sylvia Porter at the Colburn Foundation preview dinner?" Ruth read the word partner 3 times. Her eyes refused to move past it. She scrolled to the interview section. A journalist had asked Bernard about work-life balance. His answer was printed in bold type. "I keep my private life private," he had said. "My focus is on the company and its future." No mention of a wife. No mention of a son. Ruth set the phone down. Walked to the bathroom. Gripped the edge of the sink with both hands. She looked at her reflection. Tired. Soft. Unrecognizable. "Who are you?" she whispered again. This time, the question felt different. Not plaintive. Not desperate. Almost angry. That evening, Bernard came home late. She was in the kitchen, cleaning up after Oliver's dinner. He walked in, loosening his tie, reaching for the refrigerator. "I saw the article," she said. He paused. "What article?" "The profile. In the business magazine." "Oh. That." He pulled out a bottle of water, twisted off the cap. "They did a good job. Positive coverage. It says Sylvia is your partner." Bernard took a drink. "It is a business term. She represents key investors. There is no mention of me. Of us. I told you. I keep my private life private." Ruth turned from the sink. Faced him fully. "I am not private, Bernard. I am hidden." He looked at her then. Not with guilt. Not with shame. With something that might have been assessment. As though he were evaluating an asset that had depreciated. "You have let yourself go, Ruth. You do not take care of yourself the way you used to. And frankly, you are not the kind of woman people expect to see beside me anymore." The words landed like stones thrown at glass. Ruth opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Bernard continued, his voice calm and measured. "Sylvia understands the industry. She photographs well. She is an asset." He paused. Let the word settle. "And you are a liability." The word hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Liability. Ruth stared at him. This man she had married. This man for whom she had reshaped her entire life. This man who had once told her she was extraordinary. He looked at her now like she was a problem to be managed. She did not yell. She did not cry. She did not beg him to take it back. She just nodded. Okay, she said. Bernard blinked, surprised by her calm. Okay. She turned back to the sink. Yeah. Okay. He stood there for a moment, uncertain. Then he left. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the guest room door close behind him. Only then did she let herself break. She gripped the edge of the sink and sobbed quietly, so Oliver would not wake. So Bernard would not hear. She cried until her chest ached and her eyes burned and there was nothing left inside her but emptiness. And then, in the silence that followed, something shifted. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Looked at her reflection in the dark window. No more, she whispered. The next morning, Oliver woke her with tiny hands on her face. Mama. She opened her eyes. He was smiling, his hair wild from sleep. Hi, baby. Hungry. She kissed his forehead and got up. Bernard was already gone. No note. No text. The guest room door stood open, the bed made with military precision, no evidence that anyone had slept there at all. She made Oliver breakfast. Fed him. Played with him on the floor while he built towers from wooden blocks and knocked them down with delighted laughter. But her mind was somewhere else. She kept hearing Bernard's voice. Liability. She kept seeing the photographs. Sylvia's smile. Bernard's hand on her shoulder. She kept thinking about the years she had spent shrinking, quieting, disappearing. And then she thought about who she used to be. After Oliver's nap, she walked upstairs to the 3rd floor. To the studio she had not entered in nearly 2 years. The door was closed. She stood before it for a long moment, her hand on the knob, her heart beating in her throat. She turned the handle, pushed the door open. Dust motes swirled in the afternoon light. Her easel stood in the corner, empty. Her brushes waited in their jars, bristles stiff from disuse. Her specimens had long since dried and crumbled. But the light was still there. The northern light that fell through the windows like a promise. Ruth walked to the center of the room. Turned in a slow circle. Let herself remember. She had been someone here. She had created things that mattered. She had held brushes and ink and paper and transformed them into something beautiful. She could do it again. She did not know how. She did not know if her hands still remembered. She did not know if anyone would care. But standing in that dusty room, surrounded by the ghosts of the woman she used to be, Ruth made a decision. She would find out. The phone call came 3 weeks later. Ruth was cleaning Oliver's room, sorting through toys he had outgrown, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She almost did not answer. But something made her pick up. Ruth Hollis. The voice on the other end was older, sharp, familiar in a way that made Ruth's chest tighten. Ruth. It is Constance. Constance Delaney. Ruth sank onto the edge of Oliver's bed. Constance had been her mentor at the Academy of Natural Sciences. 81 years old now and still sharper than anyone Ruth had ever known. A legend in botanical illustration. A woman who had never suffered fools and never softened her opinions for anyone's comfort. They had not spoken in 3 years. Constance, Ruth said. It has been 3 years. I know. I have been asking about you. Ruth's throat tightened. I have been busy. So I have heard. Motherhood, marriage, all the acceptable excuses. Ruth said nothing. There was nothing to say. Constance continued. Are you still painting? The question was simple. The answer was not. No, Ruth said finally. The word felt like a confession. Why not? I do not have time. Or space. Or nonsense. Constance's voice was firm but not unkind. You have time for what you choose to make time for. You have space for what you decide matters. Those are not reasons, Ruth. Those are stories you are telling yourself. Ruth closed her eyes. What do you want, Constance? I am calling because something has come up. The Barlow Institute is commissioning a series of illustrations for a new reference volume. Native medicinal plants of the eastern seaboard. The kind of work you used to do before you decided to disappear. Ruth felt something flutter in her chest. Something that might have been hope, or might have been fear. They were often difficult to distinguish. They asked me to recommend someone, Constance continued. I gave them your name. Constance, I cannot. You can. You are choosing not to. There is a difference. Silence stretched between them. Ruth could hear her own breathing, too fast, too shallow. Constance's voice softened. Just slightly. I am not trying to push you. But I remember who you were, Ruth. And I do not think she is gone. Just buried. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She did not trust herself to speak. The details will arrive by email, Constance said. Look at them. Think about it. And Ruth. Yes. Whatever is happening in your life right now, whatever has made you forget yourself, remember this. You are an artist. That is not something that disappears because someone stopped looking at you. The line went quiet. Ruth sat on the edge of Oliver's bed for a long time, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to nothing. That night, after Bernard had retreated to his study and Oliver was asleep, Ruth opened her email. The commission details were there, exactly as Constance had promised. 12 illustrations. Native medicinal plants of the eastern seaboard. 3 months to complete. Payment upon delivery, along with a presentation at the Barlow Institute's annual symposium. Ruth read the requirements twice. Then a third time. She could do this. She knew she could. The knowledge was still there, buried beneath years of neglect. But the fear was there too. What if she tried and failed? What if her hands had forgotten? What if she had waited too long and the woman who could create beautiful things was truly gone? She closed the laptop, sat in the darkness of the living room. Then she stood up, walked to the guest room, and sat down at the small desk she had used for paying bills and writing thank you notes and all the invisible tasks of maintaining a household. She opened a drawer, found paper, found a pencil. She began to draw. The first line was uncertain, wavering. The second was worse. She erased, started again, erased, started again. Hours passed. The wastebasket filled with crumpled failures. Near midnight, she completed a single leaf. An oak leaf, veins rendered in careful pencil, the shape imperfect but recognizable. It was not beautiful. It was not ready for any publication. But it was real. Ruth held it up to the lamplight, studied the lines she had made. There you are, she whispered. She did not know if she was talking to the leaf or to herself. The work consumed her in ways she had forgotten were possible. Every night, after Oliver was asleep and Bernard had disappeared into his study or the guest room, Ruth sat at the small desk and drew. She ordered supplies quietly, charged to a credit card Bernard never checked. Paper, ink, brushes, specimens from a botanical supplier she had used years ago. Her hands trembled at first. The muscle memory was buried deep, reluctant to surface. She made mistakes. Threw away more drawings than she kept. Fell asleep at the desk and woke with ink on her cheek and sunlight streaming through the windows. But slowly, steadily, the skill returned. She remembered the weight of the brush. The way light fell across a petal. The precise green of new growth in early spring. She remembered patience. She remembered care. She remembered the satisfaction of rendering something exactly as it was, neither more nor less than truth. Oliver sometimes found her in the morning, still at the desk, surrounded by paper. "Mama, what are you doing?" "Working on a project," she would say. "Can I see?" She showed him a finished illustration of wild ginger. The leaves spreading like hands. The root system traced beneath the soil line. "It looks real," he said. His voice held wonder. "Thank you, baby." She held him tight. Bernard noticed nothing. He left early, returned late, spent his evenings behind closed doors. Ruth had become invisible to him years ago. Her late nights, her ink-stained fingers, the quiet transformation taking place in his own house. None of it registered. He saw what he expected to see. A wife who had let herself go. A liability. A problem he had solved by ignoring. Ruth stopped waiting for him to see her. She started seeing herself. 6 weeks after Constance's phone call, Ruth finished the first set of illustrations. 6 plants, each rendered with exacting care. Wild ginger, bloodroot, Solomon's seal, black cohosh, May apple, golden seal. She spread them across the bed, studied them in the morning light. They were good. Better than good. They were the best work she had done in years. Perhaps ever. There was something in them that had not been there before, a depth that came from having been emptied out and filled again with intention. She photographed them carefully. Sent the images to the Barlow Institute with a brief note. The response came within hours. Dr. Hollis. These are extraordinary. The committee is unanimous. We would like to feature your work prominently at the symposium. Please contact us to discuss details. Ruth read the message 3 times. Then she called Constance. They are exceptional, Constance said without preamble. Better than before. Ruth could not speak. Her throat was too tight. Constance continued. There is something else. The symposium presentation. They want you front and center. Your name, your process, your art. October 15th. Ruth's breath caught. What did you say? October 15th. The symposium is October 15th. Ruth checked the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. Her eyes found the date. October 15th was circled in red. Bernard's handwriting. Below it, 2 words. Colburn Gala. The same night. Ruth gripped the phone tighter. Where is the symposium being held? The Colburn Institute, Constance said. Lower level. The gala is on the main floor, but the symposium has its own space. Ruth said nothing. Ruth, Constance said. Are you there? I am here. Will you do it? Ruth looked at the calendar. At the red circle. At the words Bernard had written, never imagining she would see them, never imagining she would have any reason to be in that building on that night. Yes, she said. I will do it. She hung up the phone and stood very still in the kitchen. The same building. The same night. 1 floor apart. Bernard would be upstairs with Sylvia. Accepting praise. Performing the version of his life that did not include her. And Ruth would be downstairs, surrounded by her own work, her own name spoken aloud, her own presence undeniable. She did not tell Bernard about the commission. Did not mention the symposium. Did not speak of the late nights or the quiet hours of resurrection. He did not ask. He was too consumed with preparations for the gala, with Sylvia, with a carefully curated public life that Ruth was not permitted to enter. She let him believe she would be home with Oliver, as always. She arranged for a sitter. She bought a dress, deep burgundy silk, elegant and understated. She had her hair done for the first time in years, her curls shaped and shining, framing her face like a crown. She stood in front of the mirror and met her own eyes. The woman looking back was not the same woman who had disappeared into this house. She was older, softer in some places, harder in others. But she was there. She had always been there. Ruth smiled. Not for Bernard. Not for anyone else. For herself. The evening of October 15th arrived with a cold autumn rain. Bernard left at 5 o'clock. He was dressed in a dark suit, a silk tie Ruth had given him for their 5th anniversary. He checked his reflection in the hall mirror, adjusted his cuffs, picked up his keys. Do not wait up, he said. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway, Oliver beside her. She said nothing. Bernard kissed Oliver on the top of his head. Nodded to Ruth without meeting her eyes. Walked out the front door. Ruth watched him go. The taillights of his car disappeared down the wet street. The sitter arrived at 6. A college student named Maria who Oliver adored. Ruth gave her instructions, kissed her son goodbye, and walked upstairs to get ready. She took her time. She showered slowly, letting the hot water run over her skin. She moisturized carefully, deliberately. She painted her nails deep wine, the color of autumn leaves. She shaped her curls with care, let them fall naturally around her face. Full. Unapologetic. She applied makeup with precision. Lined eyes. A touch of gold on the lids that caught the light. Deep wine lips to match her nails. Then she put on the dress. The burgundy silk moved over her skin like water. Cool. Smooth. Electric. She zipped it up, turned to the mirror. The dress hugged her body. Not the body of a 20-year-old. Not the body of a woman who had never carried a child. The body of a woman who had lived. Who had created life? Who had been broken and buried and had dug herself out? She stepped into her heels. Black, sleek, sharp. She stood tall. The woman in the mirror was not Bernard's hidden wife. Not a liability. Not a problem to be managed. She was Ruth Hollis. Artist. Mother. Whole. She picked up her clutch. Checked the time. Oliver's voice came from the hallway. Mama. She turned. He was standing in the doorway in his pajamas, Maria behind him looking apologetic. He wanted to say goodnight, Maria said. Ruth knelt down to Oliver's level. He stared at her with wide eyes. Mama, he said. You look like the paintings. Her breath caught. What do you mean, baby? Beautiful, he said. Like the ones in your room. The flowers. She pulled him into her arms. Held him tight. Thank you, she whispered into his hair. Thank you, baby. She kissed him goodnight. Watched Maria lead him back to bed. Then she called a car and rode through the rainy streets toward the Colburn Institute. The building rose against the evening sky, its windows glowing gold. A red carpet stretched from the curb to the entrance. Photographers lined both sides, cameras ready, flashes illuminating the guests who arrived in sleek black cars. The gala guests. Ruth did not go to the main entrance. She walked around the side of the building, to the smaller door marked Symposium entrance. A sign directed attendees to the lower level. She showed her credentials to the woman at the desk. Received a badge with her name printed clearly. Dr. Ruth Hollis. Featured artist. She walked through the corridor toward the Symposium hall. The space was smaller than the grand ballroom upstairs. But it was full. Scientists, scholars, conservationists, museum curators. People who cared about precision and truth. People who understood that the careful rendering of a leaf was its own kind of magic. Her illustrations were displayed on easels around the perimeter of the room. 12 pieces, each one framed, each one lit with care. People leaned in close, studying the details, pointing at specific techniques. Constance found her near the window. Nervous? She asked. Ruth shook her head. No. I thought I would be. But no. Good. Constance squeezed her hand. You belong here. You always did. Ruth looked around the room. At her work. At the people who had come to see it. I know, she said quietly. I forgot. But I know. The presentation went smoothly. Ruth stood at the podium and spoke about process. About patience. About the intimacy of rendering something exactly as it is. About losing touch with her work and finding her way back. She did not mention Bernard. She did not need to. The audience listened. Asked questions. Applauded. Afterward, she stood among her paintings, receiving what she had forgotten was possible. Acknowledgement. Recognition. People shook her hand, told her they had followed her work for years, asked about commissions. She was not invisible. She was not a liability. She was seen. The evening passed in a blur of conversation and connection. Ruth moved through the room like a woman who had finally remembered how to breathe. She laughed. She spoke about plants and pigment and the particular challenge of rendering transparent petals. She felt, for the first time in years, like herself. Near 9 o'clock, a woman from the institute approached her. Dr. Hollis, she said. We have had an unusual request. Ruth turned. Yes. The Colburn Foundation Board would like to see your work. They are hosting their gala upstairs, and one of the directors heard about your presentation from a mutual contact. Would you mind if we brought a few of them down to view the exhibition? Ruth's heart slowed. Then steadied. Of course, she said. That would be fine. The woman smiled and walked away to make arrangements. Ruth stood very still in the center of the room. She knew what was coming. She could feel it the way you feel a storm building on the horizon. But she was not afraid. 10 minutes later, a small group descended the stairs. Board members. Donors. Elegantly dressed men and women with champagne flutes in hand, their voices too loud, their laughter carrying the particular tone of people who believe themselves to be at the center of the world. And behind them, Bernard. He was laughing at something someone had said. Sylvia was beside him, golden and confident in a white gown that sparkled under the lights. He did not notice Ruth at first. Why would he? She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at home with Oliver, invisible, irrelevant, waiting. Then he turned. Their eyes met across the room. Ruth did not move, did not speak, did not need to. Bernard's face shifted. Confusion first, then recognition, then disbelief, then something Ruth had never seen in him before. Uncertainty. Sylvia touched his arm, asked him something. He did not respond. He was staring at Ruth. At the woman in the burgundy dress standing in the center of her own exhibition, surrounded by her own work, her name printed on placards that everyone could read. Ruth turned back to the curator she had been speaking with. "As I was saying," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The challenge with Golden Seal is capturing the translucence of the petals without losing the structural integrity of the form." The curator nodded, engaged, attentive. Ruth did not look at Bernard again. But she felt him watching. Felt the silence where his certainty used to be. Felt the weight of everything he had dismissed standing now in full view of the world he thought he controlled. She continued her conversation. Smiled at appropriate moments. Answered questions about technique and inspiration. And across the room, Bernard stood frozen. His champagne untouched. His mask cracking. The woman he had called a liability was standing in a room full of her own beauty, her own work, her own name. And she was not looking at him at all. The moment stretched like honey, slow and golden and impossible to escape. Ruth stood in the center of her exhibition, surrounded by her work, speaking calmly with the museum curator about the challenges of botanical illustration. Her voice did not waver. Her hands did not shake. She discussed pigment and paper and the particular difficulty of capturing transparency in watercolor as though this were any ordinary evening. As though her husband were not standing 20 feet away, frozen in place, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips. Bernard stared at her. Ruth could feel the weight of his gaze without looking. She had spent 7 years learning to read his silences, his moods, the subtle shifts in his attention. She knew exactly what he was feeling right now. Confusion. Disbelief. And beneath it, something she had never seen in him before. Fear. The curator was asking her about her process. Ruth answered thoughtfully, explaining how she worked from live specimens whenever possible, how she believed that accuracy required intimacy with the subject. The curator nodded, made notes, asked follow-up questions. Ruth engaged fully, professionally, as though the most important thing in the room was this conversation, not the man across the hall who was watching his carefully constructed world develop cracks. She did not look at Bernard. She did not need to. Sylvia Porter stood beside Bernard, her hand still resting on his arm. She had been mid-sentence when they descended the stairs, laughing about something one of the board members had said. Now she was silent, her perfectly painted smile frozen in place. She followed Bernard's gaze across the room. Saw the woman in the burgundy dress. Read the name on the placard beside one of the illustrations. Dr. Ruth Hollis. Sylvia's hand dropped from Bernard's arm. She looked at the paintings. Studied them with the sharp eye of a woman who understood presentation, who knew how to read a room, who had built her career on understanding what mattered and what did not. These paintings mattered. This woman mattered. The crowd gathered around her, the respect in the curator's posture, the quality of the work displayed on every easel. All of it mattered. Sylvia looked at Bernard again. His face had gone pale beneath the warm lighting. He was staring at Ruth as though he had seen a ghost. As though the woman he had dismissed, diminished, erased from his public life had somehow materialized in the one place she was never supposed to be. "Is that?" Sylvia began. Bernard did not answer. Sylvia understood then. Perhaps for the first time since she had begun accompanying Bernard to events, she understood fully what she was. Not a partner. Not even a replacement. A placeholder. A prop. A beautiful accessory chosen because the real thing had been deemed unsuitable. She took a small step back. The distance between her and Bernard widened by inches. He did not notice. Across the room, Ruth finished her conversation with the curator. She shook the woman's hand warmly, thanked her for her interest, promised to send additional materials about her process. Then she turned. Not toward Bernard. Toward another group of guests who had been waiting patiently, a cluster of botanists from the university who wanted to discuss her rendering of Black Cohosh. She moved through the room with grace, with confidence, with the particular poise of a woman who has stopped waiting for permission to exist. Bernard watched her. Every step, every gesture, every smile she offered to people who were not him. He had called her a liability. He had told her she did not photograph well with his brand. He had hidden her away like a shameful secret, paraded another woman in her place, and convinced himself that this was simply practical. Simply business. Simply the way the world worked. And now she stood in a room full of her own accomplishments, surrounded by people who saw her value, and she was not looking at him at all. Bernard's chest tightened. He set down his champagne glass on a nearby table. The movement was automatic, unconscious. He took a step toward Ruth. Sylvia's voice stopped him. Bernard. He turned. Sylvia was looking at him with an expression he did not recognize. Something between pity and understanding. Something that made him uncomfortable. "We should go back upstairs," she said. "The Foundation president is expecting us for the toast." Bernard glanced at Ruth again. She was laughing at something one of the botanists had said. Her face was animated, alive, beautiful in a way he had forgotten she could be. "Bernard." Sylvia's voice was firmer now. "We should go." He nodded. Let her guide him back toward the stairs. Climbed them like a man walking through water, each step requiring effort he should not have needed. At the top of the stairs, he paused. Looked back down at the symposium hall. Ruth was still there. Still shining. Still surrounded by people who valued her work. She never once looked up. The gala continued around Bernard like a play in which he had forgotten his lines. He shook hands with board members. He smiled for photographs. He accepted congratulations on the company's latest acquisition, nodded along to conversations about market projections and regulatory challenges. But his mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing Ruth in that burgundy dress. The way she had stood in the center of the room, owning the space. The way people had gathered around her paintings, leaning in close, studying her work with genuine interest. He kept hearing her voice, calm and confident, discussing technique and process as though she had never stopped working, as though the year she had spent invisible in his house had been preparation rather than imprisonment. He had called her a liability. The word echoed in his mind, sharp-edged and ugly. Sylvia stayed close to him throughout the evening, but something had shifted between them. She no longer touched his arm or leaned into his space. She maintained a professional distance, smiling when necessary, making conversation when required, but the warmth had drained from her performance. Near the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned and the waiters were clearing empty glasses, Sylvia excused herself. "I have an early meeting," she said. "I should go." Bernard nodded. "I will see you Monday." She paused, looked at him for a long moment. "Bernard," she said. "The woman downstairs." He said nothing. Sylvia's voice was quiet. "I did not know." "Did not know what?" "That you were married." "I mean, I knew. But I did not know." "Not really." Bernard felt something twist in his chest. "It was business, Sylvia. Optics." She smiled, but it was sad. A thin expression that did not reach her eyes. "Is that what you tell yourself?" She turned and walked away before he could respond. Bernard stood alone in the emptying ballroom. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. The orchestra played soft music for the few remaining guests. Everything was beautiful and expensive and exactly as he had planned. But it felt hollow. He thought about going back downstairs. Finding Ruth. Saying something. But what would he say? What words could possibly bridge the distance he had created? He left through the main entrance. Got into his car. Drove through the rainy streets toward home. The house was dark when he arrived. The sitter's car was gone. Oliver was asleep. Bernard stood in the foyer for a long time. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. Rain streaked the windows. He climbed the stairs. Paused outside the master bedroom. The door was closed. He walked to the guest room instead. Changed into his pajamas. Lay down on the bed he had claimed as his own months ago. Sleep did not come. He stared at the ceiling and thought about Ruth. About the way she had looked tonight. About the way she had not looked at him. For the first time in years, Bernard Watts felt truly invisible. Ruth arrived home just after midnight. The rain had stopped, and the streets gleamed wet under the streetlights. She paid the driver, walked up the front steps, unlocked the door. The house was silent. The sitter had left a note on the kitchen counter. Oliver slept well. No problems. Ruth checked on her son. He was curled in his bed, one arm wrapped around his stuffed rabbit, his breathing deep and even. She stood in the doorway and watched him sleep, her heart full of a love so vast it felt like pain. She had done this for him too. Not just for herself. For the mother she wanted him to have. The mother who created things. The mother who stood in rooms full of her own work and was not ashamed. She closed his door gently. Walked down the hall. The guest room door was shut. Bernard was home. Ruth did not knock. Did not try to speak to him. Did not need to. She went to the master bedroom. Changed out of her dress. Hung it carefully in the closet, smoothing the silk with her fingers. She washed her face. Removed her makeup. Let her curls fall loose around her shoulders. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness. Let the night settle around her. She had done it. She had walked into his world, the world he had locked her out of, and she had carved out a space of her own. Not beside him. Not beneath him. Separate and whole. She did not know what would happen now. She did not know what Bernard would say or do. She did not know if this was the beginning of the end or simply a new kind of middle. But for the first time in years, she was not afraid. She lay down. Closed her eyes. Sleep came easily, like an old friend finally returning home. The next morning broke grey and cold. Ruth woke to the sound of Oliver's voice outside her door. He was talking to himself, narrating some adventure involving his toy dinosaurs. She smiled and rose from bed. Bernard's car was already gone from the driveway. He had left before either of them woke. Ruth made breakfast. Pancakes, Oliver's favorite, shaped into rough approximations of animals. He declared the elephant his best one and ate it first. They spent the morning together. Reading books. Building block towers. Walking in the garden despite the chill, examining the last autumn flowers before the first frost took them. Ruth pointed out the details. The curve of a petal. The pattern of veins in a yellowing leaf. Oliver listened with the particular intensity of a child who knows he is being given something important. "Mama," he said, "are you going to paint these?" "Maybe," she said. "Would you like that?" He nodded seriously. "You should paint everything." She laughed and hugged him close. "I will try, baby." Bernard came home late that evening. Ruth was in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes. Oliver was already asleep. The house had settled into its nighttime quiet, the kind of silence that used to feel oppressive but now simply felt like space. She heard the front door open. Heard his footsteps in the hallway. Heard them pause. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. Still in his work clothes, his tie loosened, his face drawn with something she might once have mistaken for exhaustion. Now she recognized it as uncertainty. "You were there," he said. Ruth continued washing a plate. "Yes. You did not tell me. You did not ask." Silence stretched between them. Ruth rinsed the plate, set it in the drying rack, reached for the next one. Bernard stepped into the kitchen. Leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest. His posture was defensive, but his voice was not. "When did you start painting again?" "A few months ago." "Why?" "Because I remembered who I was." He was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, "I did not know." Ruth looked at him then. Really looked. He seemed smaller somehow. The confidence that had always surrounded him like armor had developed cracks, and through those cracks she could see something she had not seen in years. Doubt. "You did not want to know," she said. "There is a difference." Bernard opened his mouth to respond. Closed it again. He had no answer, and they both knew it. Ruth turned back to the dishes. The water was warm on her hands. The soap bubbles caught the light. "What do you want me to say?" Bernard asked finally. Ruth considered the question. Rinsed a glass. Set it aside. "I do not need you to say anything," she said. I did not do this for you. Then why? Because I was disappearing. And I decided to stop. He stared at her. She could feel his gaze on her back, heavy with all the things he did not know how to express. I saw the paintings, he said. They were. He paused. Good. Ruth almost laughed. The word was so inadequate, so far beneath what she had created, that it felt like parody. Thank you, she said. Her voice was neutral. Bernard shifted his weight. The people there. The other guests. They seemed impressed. They were. More silence. Bernard was not accustomed to conversations he could not control. He was not accustomed to Ruth responding with such calm disinterest. The dynamics had shifted, and he did not know how to navigate the new terrain. Ruth dried her hands on a towel, hung it on the oven handle, turned to face him fully. Is there something else? He looked at her, at the woman he had married. The woman he had slowly, systematically diminished until she barely existed outside these walls. She looked different now. Not just physically, though that was part of it. She held herself differently. Her shoulders were back. Her chin was level. Her eyes met his without flinching. She looked like a woman who had stopped waiting for his permission. I do not, he began. I do not know what to do with this. Ruth nodded. I know. What happens now? She considered the question. Really considered it, not just as a response to his uncertainty but as a genuine inquiry into her own intentions. I finished the commission, she said. The symposium was just the beginning. The Barlow Institute wants me to complete the full series. 12 more illustrations. Then a presentation at their annual conference. Bernard's jaw tightened. You are going to keep working. Yes. And the events. The conferences. You will be attending those. If I choose to, yes. He pushed off from the counter. Stood upright. Tried to reclaim some of the authority he had lost. Ruth, he said. We need to talk about this properly. About how this affects the family. About how this looks. Ruth smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a cruel one either. It was simply knowing. Bernard, she said. I spent 7 years worrying about how things look to you. About how I look to you. And in all that time, you never once worried about how things look to me. That is not. It is, she said. It is exactly true. She walked past him toward the door. Paused in the doorway. I am going to bed. Oliver has a school event tomorrow. I need to rest. She climbed the stairs. Closed the bedroom door behind her. Bernard stood alone in the kitchen. The tap dripped into the empty sink. The clock on the wall marked the seconds. He had no idea what had just happened. But he knew, with a certainty that settled cold in his stomach, that something fundamental had changed. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way that felt like waiting. Bernard adjusted. That was the word Ruth used when she thought about it. He adjusted the way a man adjusts to a minor injury, favoring the wounded limb while pretending nothing was wrong. He stopped mentioning Sylvia. The photographs from events no longer featured her beside him. Whether she had withdrawn or he had pulled back, Ruth did not know and did not ask. He began coming home earlier. Not much earlier, but enough to notice. He would arrive while Oliver was still awake, would sit in the living room while Ruth gave their son his bath, would be present in a way he had not been for years. He watched Ruth differently too. Not with the dismissive glances she had grown accustomed to, but with a kind of cautious attention. As though she were a painting he had walked past 1,000 times and only now realized was valuable. Ruth noticed all of this. She did not comment on it. She was too busy working. The Barlow Commission consumed her days. She had moved back into the studio on the 3rd floor, had cleaned out the dust and ordered new specimens and restored the space to what it had once been. Light poured through the windows in the morning. Her brushes waited in their jars. Her hands remembered everything they had forgotten. She worked with an intensity that surprised even herself. Each illustration was better than the last. Each plant rendered with such precision and warmth that they seemed to breathe on the page. Constance called weekly to check on her progress. You sound different, Constance said one afternoon. Ruth paused, her brush suspended over a half-finished rendering of wild bergamot. Different how? Alive. You sound alive again. Ruth smiled. I am. Good. Do not forget it this time. I will not. She hung up and returned to her work. The bergamot was tricky. The petals were delicate, prone to wilting even in water. She had to work quickly to capture them before they changed. But that was the nature of the work. That was what she had always loved about it. The urgency. The intimacy. The way each piece required her full attention, her complete presence. She had spent 7 years absent from her own life. She was done with absence now. Oliver became her constant companion in the studio. He would sit on a small stool beside her easel, watching as she worked. Sometimes he drew his own pictures, crayons moving across paper with enthusiastic imprecision. Sometimes he asked questions about the plants, about why the leaves were shaped a certain way, about what the flowers smelled like. Ruth answered everything. She wanted him to understand that curiosity was valuable, that attention was a gift, that the world was full of things worth seeing if you bothered to look. "Mama," he said one afternoon. "Is this your job?" Ruth considered the question. "Yes," she said. "It is." "Do you like it?" "I love it." He nodded, satisfied. "Then it is a good job." "Yes, baby. It is a good job." She watched him return to his drawing. He was creating something elaborate, a forest filled with creatures of his own invention. Dragons with flower petals for wings. Trees with faces. A river that spiraled upward into the sky. He had her eyes, Ruth realized. The same shape, the same depth. But he saw the world differently than she did. He saw possibilities where she saw precision. Imagination where she saw accuracy. She wondered what he would become. What paths he would choose. What version of himself he would grow into. She hoped, more than anything, that he would never forget how to see the world as full of wonder. Bernard appeared in the studio doorway one evening. Ruth was cleaning her brushes, the day's work drying on the easel. Oliver was downstairs with the sitter, eating dinner. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of cartoons playing on the television. Bernard stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "You used to work up here before," he said. "Before Oliver was born." Ruth nodded. "Yes. I remember visiting. Watching you paint." She said nothing. She remembered too. He had been different then. Or perhaps he had always been who he was, and she had simply been too in love to notice. Bernard stepped into the studio. Looked around at the specimens in their jars, the works in progress pinned to the walls, the careful organization of a working space. "It looks the same," he said. "As before. Some things do not change." He was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, "I was wrong." Ruth continued cleaning her brush. The bristles moved against her palm, soft and familiar. "About what?" she asked. "About you. About what I said." He paused. "About the liability comment." Ruth set the brush down, turned to face him. Bernard looked uncomfortable in a way she had rarely seen. He was a man accustomed to confidence, to certainty, to knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. This uncertainty did not suit him. "I should not have said that," he continued. "It was cruel." "Yes, it was." He winced. "I do not know why I said it." "I do," Ruth said. "You said it because you believed it. Because somewhere along the way, you decided that my value was determined by how I looked beside you in photographs. By whether I fit your image. By whether I made your life easier or more complicated. That is not." "It is," she said. "It is exactly what happened. And you need to understand something, Bernard. I am not angry with you. I was. For a long time. But I am not anymore." He stared at her. "You are not." "No. Being angry at you required me to still care about your opinion. And I have stopped." The words landed between them like a door closing. Bernard's face shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, something that might have been pain or might have been the first stirrings of understanding. "What does that mean?" he asked. "For us." Ruth considered the question. She had been considering it for weeks, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "I know that I will not go back to being invisible. I know that I will not shrink myself to fit your expectations. I know that Oliver deserves a mother who is whole, not a mother who is hiding. And me? Bernard asked. What do I deserve? Ruth looked at him. At the man she had married. At the man who had slowly, systematically erased her from his life. That is not for me to decide, she said. That is for you to figure out. She turned back to her work. After a long moment, she heard his footsteps retreat down the stairs. She did not watch him go. The call came on a Tuesday in late November. Ruth was in the studio, putting the finishing touches on the final illustration of the series. 12 plants, each one rendered with precision and love. The complete set would be published in the spring. Her name would appear on the cover. Her phone rang. Constance. It is done, Ruth said by way of greeting. The last one. I will send photographs this afternoon. Good, Constance said. But that is not why I am calling. Ruth set down her brush. What is it? The Touring Exhibition Committee reviewed your symposium work. They want to include you in next year's program. Ruth's breath caught. The Touring Exhibition. She knew what that meant. Major museums. International venues. Her work seen by thousands of people across the country. Ruth, Constance said. Did you hear me? I heard you. And. Ruth stood up. Walked to the window. Looked out at the garden below, where the last chrysanthemums were still blooming despite the cold. Yes, she said. Tell them yes. Constance laughed. That is the Ruth I remember. No hesitation. No false modesty. Just yes. Ruth smiled. I am done with hesitation. Good. The details will arrive by email. First venue is the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Your old stomping grounds. Ruth closed her eyes. The Academy. Where she had first learned botanical illustration. Where Constance had taught her to see plants not as objects but as living systems, complex and beautiful and worthy of attention. It felt like coming home. Thank you, she said. For everything. Do not thank me, Constance said. You did the work. I just reminded you that you could. They hung up. Ruth stood at the window for a long time. The afternoon light was fading, the sky turning grey and gold. Winter was coming, but she did not feel cold. She felt alive. She told Bernard that evening. He was in his study, reviewing documents. She knocked on the door, waited for his acknowledgement, entered. I have news, she said. He looked up. Set down his pen. His expression was careful now, the way it had been since the symposium. As though he was no longer sure what to expect from her. The Touring Exhibition Committee has selected my work for next year's program, Ruth said. 6 museums. Starting at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Bernard was silent for a moment. Then, quietly, congratulations. Thank you. Another silence. Bernard shifted in his chair. This is significant, he said. Yes. People will know your name. Professionally. Yes. He nodded slowly. Processing. Ruth could see him trying to fit this information into his understanding of the world, trying to find the place where it made sense. She did not help him. It was not her job to make sense of things for him anymore. I wanted you to know, she said. Because it will require travel. Time away. And Oliver. Oliver will come with me when possible. When not, arrangements will be made. Bernard's jaw tightened. You have already decided this. I have already decided to pursue my work. The logistics will be figured out. And me, he asked. Where do I fit in these logistics? Ruth looked at him steadily. That depends on you. On me. Yes. She took a breath. I am not asking for your permission, Bernard. I stopped needing your permission a long time ago. I am informing you because we share a son and a household and technically a marriage. But the decision is mine. The work is mine. The life I am building is mine. Bernard stared at her. The woman standing before him was not the woman he had married. Not the woman he had slowly diminished over 7 years. Not the woman who had accepted his dismissals and his absences and his cruelty. This woman was something new. Something he did not recognize. something he could not control. "I do not know who you are anymore," he said. Ruth smiled. "I know. That is because you never really looked." She left his study, closed the door behind her. In the hallway, she paused, listened to the silence, felt the weight of the moment settling around her. Then she walked upstairs to the studio and continued her work. The months that followed moved with their own rhythm. Ruth completed the Barlow Commission. The publication date was set for April. Her illustrations would be featured in a reference volume that would be used by botanists and herbalists and students for decades to come. The touring exhibition preparations began. Curators contacted her about framing and lighting. Journalists requested interviews. A small profile appeared in a Philadelphia arts magazine, featuring a photograph of Ruth in her studio, surrounded by her work. She cut out the article and pinned it to the wall. Bernard saw it one evening when he came home early. "You are in the news," he said. "A small feature. Nothing significant." He studied the photograph. "You look different." "I am different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a question he had never asked before. "Are you happy?" Ruth considered her answer. Happiness felt like the wrong word. It was too simple for what she felt, too small for the complexity of her emotions. "I am becoming myself," she said finally. "Whether that is the same as happy, I do not know. But it is better than what I was before." Bernard nodded slowly. He did not ask what she was before. He already knew. That night, he did not go to the guest room. He hesitated in the hallway, looking at the master bedroom door, and for a moment Ruth thought he might knock. Might try to reclaim some piece of what they had lost. But he turned away. Went to his study. Closed the door. Ruth heard him moving around inside. Opening drawers. Shuffling papers. She did not know what he was looking for. She was no longer sure she cared. Winter settled over Philadelphia like a held breath. The house on Delancey Street grew quieter. Bernard worked longer hours, or claimed to. Ruth suspected he simply did not know what to do with himself when he was home. The certainty that had once defined him had eroded, leaving something uncertain and searching in its place. They spoke in the mornings, brief exchanges about Oliver's schedule and household logistics. They passed each other in hallways, nodded politely, moved on. They were two people sharing a space but living separate lives. Ruth did not know if this was sustainable. She did not know if she wanted it to be. But she was not ready to make decisions. Not yet. She was still learning who she was becoming, still growing into the shape of her new self. Marriage counseling or divorce lawyers would come later, if they came at all. For now, there was only the work. Only the daily practice of showing up for herself. Oliver noticed the changes, in the way children notice everything. "Mama," he asked one evening during bath time, "is Daddy sad?" Ruth paused, a soapy washcloth in her hand. "Why do you ask, baby?" "He looks sad. His face looks tired." Ruth considered how to answer. She did not want to lie to her son. But she also did not want to burden him with adult complexities he could not yet understand. "Sometimes grown-ups feel many things at once," she said carefully. "Your daddy has a lot to think about. But that is not for you to worry about. Is he sad because of you?" Ruth's heart clenched. "Why would you think that?" Oliver shrugged, water splashing. "Because you are different now. You smile more. But he smiles less." Ruth set down the washcloth. Looked at her son, at his earnest face and his questioning eyes. "Baby," she said gently. "Sometimes when people change, other people do not know how to feel about it. That is not bad. It is just different. But you are happy now." "I am working on being happy." "Yes. Good." Oliver nodded firmly. "I like when you are happy. You paint better when you are happy." Ruth laughed, surprised. "How do you know that?" "The paintings look different. The ones from now are brighter than the old ones in the attic." Ruth stared at him. He had found her old work, the pieces she had stored away years ago, and he had noticed the difference. "You are very observant," she said. "What does observant mean?" "It means you see things. Really see them. Like you do. When you paint." "Yes, baby." Like I do. Oliver smiled. Then I want to be observant too. Ruth pulled him into a wet hug, not caring about the water soaking her clothes. You already are, she whispered into his hair. You already are. The first exhibition opened in March. The Academy of Natural Sciences had dedicated an entire gallery to Ruth's work. 24 pieces spanning 3 years of renewed creation. The walls were painted a soft grey that made the colours of her illustrations seem to glow. Ruth arrived early on opening night. She wore the burgundy dress again, the one from the symposium. It felt right, like armour that had proved itself in battle. Constance met her at the entrance. Nervous? She asked. Ruth shook her head. Terrified. Constance laughed. Good. Terror means you care. They walked through the gallery together. Ruth's name was printed on a large placard at the entrance. Dr. Ruth Hollis, Studies in Botanical Precision. The words looked strange and wonderful, like seeing her own reflection after years of forgetting she had a face. People began arriving at 7. Scientists, artists, collectors, journalists. Ruth moved through the crowd, shaking hands, answering questions, accepting compliments with a grace she had not known she possessed. She was not performing. That was the difference. She was not trying to be what anyone expected. She was simply present, simply herself, and that was enough. Near 8 o'clock, a familiar figure appeared at the gallery entrance. Bernard. He was wearing a dark suit, perfectly tailored. He held a small bouquet of flowers in one hand. He looked nervous in a way Ruth had never seen, uncertain of his welcome, unsure of his place. He had not told her he was coming. Ruth excused herself from the conversation she was having. Walked toward him. Stopped a few feet away. You came, she said. He nodded. I did not know if you would want me to. I did not know either. They stood in silence. Around them, the crowd murmured and moved. People glanced at them curiously, sensing drama, wondering about the story. Bernard held out the flowers. For you. Congratulations. Ruth took them. They were trout lilies, the same flower that had been in the painting where they first met. The same flower he had stood before for an hour, all those years ago, before he knew her name. You remembered, she said. I remember everything about that night. I have been thinking about it a lot lately. Ruth looked at the flowers. At the delicate petals, the curved stamens, the particular yellow that she had spent weeks learning to capture. What have you been thinking? She asked. Bernard took a breath. That I met someone extraordinary. And then I spent years trying to make her ordinary. Because extraordinary things are harder to control. Ruth said nothing. She waited. I do not know how to fix what I broke, he continued. I do not know if it can be fixed. But I wanted to be here. I wanted to see what you created. I wanted to remember who you were when I first saw you. He paused. Swallowed. I wanted to remember who I was, he said quietly. Before I forgot. Ruth looked at him. At the man she had married. At the man who had diminished her, hidden her, erased her from his public life. He looked different now. Smaller, somehow. The armor of his confidence had cracked, and through the cracks she could see something she had not seen in years. A man who was lost. Ruth did not know if she could forgive him. Did not know if forgiveness was even the right framework for what had happened between them. Some things could not be forgiven because some things were not accidents. They were choices, made over and over, day after day, until the accumulated weight became unbearable. But she also knew that holding on to anger was its own kind of prison. Thank you for coming, she said finally. It means something. Bernard nodded. His eyes were bright, and she realized with a shock that he was close to tears. I am proud of you, he said. I know that does not matter. I know I lost the right to be proud. But I am. Ruth touched his arm. The first time she had touched him voluntarily in months. It does matter, she said. Just not the way it used to. She turned away. Walked back toward the crowd, toward the people who were waiting to talk about her work. Bernard watched her go. He stayed at the exhibition until it closed, looking at her paintings, reading the descriptions, studying the work of the woman he had tried to make invisible. He left without saying goodbye. Ruth saw him slip out the door, a solitary figure against the night. She did not follow. The weeks after the exhibition opening were full. Interviews, gallery visits, discussions with curators from the next venue on the tour. Ruth's name appeared in arts publications, in botanical journals, in local newspapers that celebrated a Philadelphia native reclaiming her place in the world. She saved every article. Not from vanity, but from a kind of wonder. Each mention of her name was proof that she existed. Proof that she had not disappeared, no matter how hard someone had tried to make her. Oliver accompanied her to several events. He was getting older now, more articulate, more curious. He asked questions about the people she met, about why they cared about flowers and leaves, about what made her painting special. He seemed proud to be her son. Ruth had not realized how much that would mean until she felt it. Bernard continued to hover at the edges of her life. He attended more events than he was invited to, always staying in the background, always watching. He did not bring Sylvia. He did not bring anyone. He came alone and left alone and never asked for more than Ruth was willing to give. She did not know what to make of it. One evening, after a particularly long day of travel and interviews, she came home to find him waiting in the kitchen. "Oliver is asleep," he said. "The sitter left an hour ago." Ruth set down her bag. "You did not have to wait up. I wanted to talk." She looked at him carefully. "About what?" He gestured to the table, where 2 cups of tea sat steaming. "About us. About what happens now." Ruth sat down, picked up her cup. The warmth felt good against her palms. "What do you want to happen?" she asked. Bernard sat across from her. He looked tired, but not the exhausted tiredness of before. Something different. Something deeper. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said. About how I saw you as a liability." Ruth said nothing. She waited. "I have been trying to understand why I did that. Why I spent years making you smaller when I married you because you were extraordinary. And..." He shook his head. "I do not have a good answer. I think I was afraid. Of your talent. Of your independence. Of the possibility that you might not need me." Ruth considered this. It was honest in a way Bernard had rarely been. "So you made me need you," she said. "By taking everything else away." "Yes." He looked at her. "I did not think of it that way at the time. I told myself I was providing for you, protecting you. But really I was just..." He stopped. Swallowed. "Just what?" "Building a cage. And calling it a home." Silence stretched between them. The tea cooled in their cups. Ruth felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness. Not exactly. But something adjacent to it. Something that made space for complexity. For the possibility that people could harm each other and still be human. Could betray each other and still be worthy of compassion. She did not know if she wanted to stay married to Bernard. Did not know if what they had built could be rebuilt into something worth having. But she knew, sitting at that table in the quiet kitchen, that she did not hate him anymore. "I do not know what I want," she said honestly. "I do not know if there is a path forward for us or if we have already passed the point of no return." Bernard nodded. "I know. But I am willing to try," she continued. "Not to go back to what we were. I will never go back to that. But maybe to find something new. Something that makes space for both of us to be whole." "What would that look like?" "I do not know," Ruth said. "We would have to figure it out together." Bernard reached across the table. Stopped short of touching her hand. "I would like to try," he said. "If you will let me." Ruth looked at his hand, hovering near hers. At the man she had loved, then lost, then found herself tangled with in ways she still did not fully understand. She did not take his hand. "Not yet." "Okay," she said. "We will try." It was not a promise. It was not forgiveness. It was not a happy ending wrapped in a bow. It was just a beginning. A crack in the door. A willingness to see what might grow in the space between what was and what could be. Ruth finished her tea. Stood up. Looked down at her husband. "I am going to bed," she said. "We can talk more tomorrow." He nodded. "Good night, Ruth." "Good night, Bernard." She walked upstairs. Paused at Oliver's door, listened to his breathing, felt the weight of love and responsibility settle over her like a blanket. Then she went to the master bedroom and closed the door. Tomorrow would come with its own questions, its own challenges, its own choices. But tonight, she slept peacefully. The spring arrived with its usual fanfare of blossoms and birdsong. Ruth's touring exhibition moved from Philadelphia to Boston to New York. Each venue brought new audiences, new recognition, new opportunities. Her name appeared in publications she had only dreamed of reading. Collectors inquired about purchasing original works. Universities invited her to speak. She said yes to some things and no to others. She was learning to guard her time, to protect her energy, to choose only what served her work and her well-being. Oliver finished kindergarten and started first grade. He drew constantly now, filling sketchbooks with his own creations. Ruth bought him good quality pencils and paper, taught him about light and shadow, encouraged his creativity without trying to shape it. He was becoming his own person. That was as it should be. Bernard remained present but changed. He no longer tried to control the narrative. He no longer spoke of optics or image or what people expected. He attended Ruth's events when invited, stayed home when not, parented Oliver with an attention he had not shown before. They were rebuilding something. Ruth was not sure what to call it. Not a marriage in the traditional sense. Something more complicated. Something that acknowledged the damage and tried to grow around it, the way a tree grows around a wound. Some nights they talked until late, sitting on the back porch as the stars emerged overhead. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their failures. They talked about Oliver and what kind of people they wanted to be for him. Other nights they sat in comfortable silence, reading separate books, occupying the same space without needing to fill it with words. Ruth did not know if this was love. It did not feel like the love she had known before, the consuming fire that had drawn her to Bernard in the first place. It felt quieter, steadier, like a candle instead of a bonfire. Something that could sustain instead of something that would burn out. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what love became after everything else was stripped away. Or maybe it was just two people trying to do better than they had before. Ruth was not sure it mattered. What mattered was the trying. The final venue of the touring exhibition was the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington. Ruth stood in the gallery on opening night, surrounded by her work, watching visitors move through the space. Families with children. Students taking notes. Elderly couples holding hands. All of them looking at what she had created. Constance appeared beside her. Leaning on a cane now, her steps slower than they had been, but her eyes as sharp as ever. "Well," she said. "You did it." Ruth smiled. "We did it." "No," Constance said firmly. "I made a phone call. You did everything else." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the crowd. "What will you do next?" Constance asked. Ruth considered the question. There were offers on the table. A book deal. A teaching position. Another commission. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I think I will take some time. Be with Oliver. Figure out what I want." "Good," Constance said. "That is the right answer." "What is the right answer?" Constance smiled. "Not knowing. Being comfortable with not knowing. That is how you stay curious. That is how you keep creating." Ruth looked at her mentor, at the woman who had believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." Constance shrugged. "I told you. You did the work. But you reminded me I could." Constance patted her arm. "That is what we do for each other. That is what makes us human." They watched the crowd a little longer. Then Constance announced she was tired and needed to sit down, and Ruth walked her to a bench near the exit. "I will see you in Philadelphia," Constance said. "Lunch. Next month. It is a date." Constance squeezed her hand and walked slowly out the door. Ruth watched her go. Then she turned back to the gallery, to her work, to the life she had rebuilt from the ashes of the one that had been taken from her. She thought about Bernard. About Oliver. About the house on Delancey Street with its high ceilings and its complicated history. She thought about the woman she had been before all of this. Young and talented and full of hope. She thought about the woman she had become after. Diminished and invisible and lost. And she thought about the woman she was now. Older than both of those versions. Wiser. More scarred. More whole. She was not the same person who had walked into that gallery in Philadelphia all those years ago and caught a stranger's eye. She was better. Bernard found her near the end of the evening. He had driven down from Philadelphia with Oliver, who had spent the day at the Air and Space Museum before joining them for the opening. Oliver was asleep now in a chair in the corner, exhausted from excitement, clutching a stuffed airplane he had begged for at the gift shop. Bernard stood beside Ruth, looking at her paintings. "They really are extraordinary," he said. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, "I should have told you that more before, when it might have mattered." Ruth looked at him. "It matters now, does it?" She considered the question. "Yes." Different from how it would have mattered then. "But yes." Bernard nodded. He seemed to be searching for words, grasping for something he could not quite articulate. "I am trying," he said finally, "to be different. I do not know if I am succeeding." "You are trying. That is enough for now. Is it?" Ruth turned to face him fully. "Bernard," she said, "I spent 7 years disappearing because I thought that was what you needed from me. I will not spend another day being anything other than exactly who I am. If you can live with that, we have something to build on. If you cannot, we will figure out another path." He met her eyes. "I can live with that. Can you? Really? I am learning to." He paused. "You terrify me, you know. You always did. I just did not know what to do with it." Ruth almost laughed. "I terrified you. Your talent. Your focus. The way you saw things." He shook his head. "I think I tried to make you smaller because I did not know how to stand beside someone so extraordinary." Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite forgiveness, but something related to it. Understanding, perhaps. Compassion. "I did not need you to make me smaller," she said gently. "I needed you to grow." "I know." He looked at the paintings again. "I am trying to grow now." Ruth reached out. Took his hand. It was the first time she had reached for him in nearly a year. Bernard's breath caught. He looked at their intertwined fingers as though he could not quite believe they were real. "One day at a time," Ruth said. "One day at a time," he agreed. They stood together in the gallery, surrounded by Ruth's work, their sleeping son in the corner, their complicated history stretching behind them and their uncertain future stretching ahead. It was not a perfect ending. It was not even an ending at all. It was just a moment. One moment in a life full of moments. But it was enough. And sometimes, in this strange and beautiful world, enough is everything. The painting Ruth completed 3 months later was different from anything she had done before. It was not a botanical illustration. Not a precise rendering of leaves and petals and root systems. It was something looser, something stranger, something that came from a place she had not known existed. It showed a woman standing in a field of wildflowers. The woman's back was to the viewer, her figure half-turned, her face obscured. Around her, the flowers rose tall and wild, refusing any attempt at order or control. The woman was not picking the flowers or studying them or rendering them on paper. She was simply standing among them. Being. Ruth hung the painting in her studio, above the window where the northern light fell like a blessing. She did not show it to anyone. Did not post it online or include it in exhibitions. It was hers alone. A record of a transformation. A reminder of who she had been and who she was becoming. Oliver came into the studio one afternoon and stood before it. "Mama," he said. "Is that you?" Ruth smiled. "What makes you think that?" "The way she is standing. Like she is not worried about anything. Like she knows exactly where she belongs." Ruth pulled her son close. "That is a beautiful interpretation, baby. But is it you?" Ruth looked at the painting. At the woman in the field. At the wildflowers surrounding her like an embrace. "Yes," she said softly. "It is me." Oliver nodded, satisfied. "I like it. It is your best one." "Why do you think that?" "Because she looks happy." Ruth kissed the top of his head. Held him tight. "She does," she agreed. "She really does." And in that moment, Surrounded by her work and her son and the life she had rebuilt from nothing, Ruth knew something with perfect clarity. She was not invisible anymore. She never had been. She had just been standing in a room full of people who refused to look. But now she was standing in her own light. And she was never going to dim it again. This concludes our story for today. Thank you for staying with me, my beloved listeners. Thank you for investing your time and your hearts in Ruth's journey. This story was never about revenge. It was never about making someone pay. The most powerful justice is not confrontation. It is not even recognition. It is the quiet, irreversible act of becoming visible again. On your own terms. In your own time. In your own light. If you have ever been hidden, dismissed, or told you do not belong, remember this. The people who refuse to see you do not get to decide when you shine. You do. And you always did. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Be kind to one another. And never forget your own extraordinary worth. Goodbye for now.